Hi Guy, welcome back TV Spoilers. Billy didn't do it in a moment of impulse, and it wasn't the product of a single reckless burst of anger. He stepped into the decision with a kind of cold precision that even he found terrifying, because it felt like the mindset of someone who had reached the point where every principle he once clung to had become a weight around his throat. With Newman Enterprises tightening its defenses against increasingly sophisticated threats, with every contingency plan treated like the final wall protecting an empire, Billy was the one standing inside that wall, studying it from the shadows, quietly asking himself whether it deserved to remain intact. His access to Newman Media's internal systems wasn't just a professional privilege. It was a master key to the deepest layers of strategy, the emergency protocols, the silent countermeasures Victoria had built with her reputation and her future on the line. Billy understood that each piece of information smuggled out would be like pulling bricks from the foundation, and when the structure finally collapsed, the first people crushed would be the ones closest to him. And yet he kept moving forward, because something inside him had become more dangerous than greed, the conviction that he was being pushed out of the game, treated like a man allowed to watch but never truly choose, while others shaped his fate behind closed doors and dressed their control up as loyalty. Billy exploited old relationships like familiar roads leading back into Forbidden's territory, and when he needed a softer mask, he let the easy comfort of his connection to Sally become a fog that blurred the edges of his intentions. He didn't make her an accomplice, didn't drag her into the heart of the secret, but he used closeness the way desperate people do, quietly, skillfully, almost shamefully. He relied on the fact that people stop guarding their instincts when they believe they're just talking about ordinary life. The late-night logins, the casual checks of reports, the slow gathering of files tied to Newman Enterprises' defensive strategies. Billy collected everything in careful slices, measured drops. Never enough at once to trigger alarms or leave obvious gaps. He knew the Newman machine was built on suspicion, and he knew Victoria was the kind of leader who could smell betrayal before anyone else even dared to name it. That knowledge didn't stop him. It only made him more patient, like a thief who understands that the most difficult part isn't stealing what you want, but leaving without a footprint. When Billy finally approached Phyllis and Kane, it wasn't frantic or sloppy. He turned it into a transaction that reeked of calculation and old debts, the kind of alliance everyone recognizes as poisonous and still swallows because the short-term benefit tastes like survival. Phyllis never accepted gifts for free. She looked at Billy like a piece that had wandered off the board but could still be useful if positioned correctly. Kane wasn't easily fooled either. His ambition lived beneath a composed exterior, and he understood that what Billy offered wasn't just data, but a breach in Newman Enterprises' armor. Billy laid out his proposal without dressing it in ideals, without pretending it came from some noble place. It was simple, cold, and brutally direct. He had what they needed, and he needed what they could provide. What they could provide didn't even have to be money, and it didn't need a clean label. Sometimes the real payment was the sensation that Billy still had choices, still had leverage, still possessed the power to make others respond instead of being forced to accept decisions made without him. Phyllis and Kane agreed to receive the leaks not because they trusted Billy, but because they trusted the usefulness of a fracture inside the Newman world. Each of them had their own agenda, and the fact that those agendas didn't fully align made the deal even more dangerous. Billy recognized that, but he didn't step back. He began feeding them the confidential data piece by piece, meticulous and cautious, like a man walking through a hallway lined with sensors. There were nights he didn't sleep, staring at diagrams and contingency plans the way someone stares at a map toward destruction. He told himself he was in control, that he was managing the damage, that he wasn't burning the house down, just adjusting the balance of power. But every time he sent another fragment, the emptiness inside him grew heavier, because he knew he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. and no amount of self-justification could reverse the direction of what he'd started. Meanwhile, Victoria began to feel the shift. It wasn't vague paranoia. It was the sharp instinct of someone who has survived long enough in corporate warfare to recognize the moment an enemy starts reading your thoughts. Newman's defensive plans were designed to counter threats from the outside, but suddenly those plans were being anticipated in ways that felt almost intimate. As if someone already knew every response Newman would make and had prepared a counterstrike for each one. Victoria didn't panic. She didn't lash out. She watched. She studied patterns, traced inconsistencies, observed how decisions were being neutralized and strategies redirected off course. The more she observed, the more she sensed the stench of betrayal wasn't coming from rival forces, it was coming from a hand she once considered familiar. That realization chilled her, because in a family like the Newmans, betrayal isn't merely lost information. It's the collapse of trust, the one currency that has been built through blood, sacrifice, and impossible acts of forgiveness. A chance clue appeared like a thin streak of light cutting through darkness, and it was enough for Victoria to begin rebuilding the puzzle from the edges inward. She didn't need complete proof, immediately one irregularity, one thread to pull, one detail that didn't belong. If that clue came from Adam, it wouldn't have been offered as mercy or kindness. Adam's help, when it came, often carried its own sharpness, a reminder that even family assistance could feel like a blade. Still, whether they stood on opposite sides of life or not, both Adam and Victoria understood the same survival rule. The greatest danger to an empire almost always comes from within. Victoria seized the hint like a rope in a maze and followed it deeper. When she did, Billy's name surfaced not as a guess, but as a slap across her face. The moment Victoria became certain that Billy was the leak didn't bring relief. It brought rage so thick it turned into pain. Billy wasn't an outsider she could easily categorize as an enemy. He was someone who had once stood near her, someone who had known her, someone who had understood exactly how ruthless this family could be to anyone labeled a liability. That was what made his betrayal feel personal in the worst possible way, not just a strike against Newman Enterprises, but a strike against the softest part of Victoria's heart. The part that still believed a few people would never cross certain lines. In that moment, she realized those lines had always been an illusion she built to survive. When the illusion shattered, she had only two choices: become harder, colder, more relentless, or be crushed by her own vulnerability. Victoria confronted Billy, and the confrontation didn't require shouting to feel explosive. The danger wasn't in dialogue, it was in the atmosphere between them, thick enough to suffocate. She entered the space with the kind of stillness that made Billy feel the ground shift beneath him. Her eyes held him the way someone looks at a stranger, and that alone created a distance that felt like a cliff opening at their feet. Billy understood instantly that he had lost the most important thing, the right to be explained away with sincerity. Victoria hadn't come to listen. She had come to judge. She accused him of betraying the family, betraying her interests, betraying every last effort Newman Enterprises had made to hold itself together in a storm. She looked straight at him without flinching, forcing him to feel the full weight of what he had done. Billy tried to justify himself, but even in the privacy of his own mind, he knew his reasons weren't pure anymore. He could tell himself it was about being dismissed, about being underestimated, about reclaiming control over a life that always seemed to be managed by other people. He could point to old wounds, to the way he had been pulled in and pushed out of Newman's circles like a disposable tool. He could insist he never wanted to destroy the empire, only reshape it. But none of that sounded clean in the face of Victoria's stare. Because she didn't care what he felt. She cared what he did. And what he did couldn't be washed away by emotion, especially when it directly threatened the survival of everything she had fought to protect. Victoria refused his explanations not because she couldn't understand, but because she understood too well. She knew how disappointment could turn someone into a saboteur. She knew how loneliness could become a justification for decisions that poison everyone around them. But she also knew something more important. If she softened now, she would send a message that Newman Enterprises could be gutted from the inside without consequences. And she couldn't allow that. Not in a world where enemies would smell weakness faster than anyone else could name it. She held her ground with ruthless discipline, as if cutting off a part of herself to save what remained. The price of that rigidity was emptiness, but Victoria accepted it because she had learned long ago that sometimes the only choices available are different versions of pain. Billy and Victoria's relationship, already strained, already fragile, stood on the edge of total collapse. This wasn't the kind of conflict that could be smoothed over by time, regret, or another cycle of anger and forgiveness. This went deeper than any argument they'd had before, because it struck at the foundation itself, loyalty. Billy realized he had lost his place in Victoria's eyes in a way that couldn't be repaired with apologies. And Victoria realized that some betrayals don't merely damage a plant, they damage the ability to trust anyone ever again. She could reinforce the company's systems. She could seal the breach and patch the leaks. But she couldn't easily repair the hole carved into her heart because the person who carved it was Billy. The tension spread outward like a crack racing through glass, cutting through both the corporate world and the family that held it together. Victoria began to view every decision in a sharper light, questioning who truly stood with her and who might be silently waiting for the right moment to sell Newman's secrets for their own advantage. Billy walked away from the confrontation with the sickening awareness that he had become the weakest link, the easiest scapegoat, the one most likely to be sacrificed first if everything detonated. Worse than the fear of consequences was the deeper horror of what he had turned into, the very type of man he once swore he would never be. Someone who used other people's secrets as bargaining chips for his own personal resentment. And when the doors closed and the night swallowed the last traces of the confrontation, the war didn't end. It simply changed form, quieter, sharper, more lethal. Victoria didn't just want to stop the leak anymore. She wanted to know exactly how much Billy had given away and whether anyone else knew more than they admitted. Billy didn't just fear exposure, he feared the moment Phyllis and Kane began to shape the stolen data into weapons he could no longer control. Newman Enterprises was standing in the path of a storm, and at the center of it, one cruel truth became impossible to ignore. Sometimes enemies don't need to break in at all, because the door has already been opened from the inside. And just when Victoria believed she had mapped Billy's betrayal completely, one small detail buried in the chain of leaked data froze her blood. Because it didn't look like something Billy could have accessed on his own. It looked like the fingerprint of a second Hansamine behind him, unseen, quietly guiding and exploiting this collapse to serve a larger purpose, forcing Victoria to face the question she was least prepared to ask. Was Billy truly the only traitor here, or was he merely the first pawn pushed out of the shadows? Billy didn't step onto this path because he had no other options, chose it on purpose, because it was the one thing guaranteed to hurt Victoria the most. After years of being trapped in the same exhausting cycle of disappointment, of being offered a chance only to have it yanked away like he was nothing more than a disposable extra in the Newman family's power story, Billy began to believe that his pain would always be dismissed unless he created an explosion so loud no one could ignore it. The more he watched Victoria stand unshaken through every corporate storm, the more he saw her bracing herself as the Empire's shield. The more he felt like a man pushed off the chessboard not because he lacked talent, but because he no longer deserved trust in the way he craved. His anger stopped looking like simple jealousy or wounded pride. It evolved into something darker, more corrosive, the feeling that Victoria always had the right to define who he was, while he never had the right to define himself. And once that belief settled into his bones, Billy didn't want to win by proving his worth anymore. He wanted to win by forcing Victoria to lose control, to unravel, to taste the same pressure she had once placed on others and called it leadership. With Newman Enterprises already tightening its defenses against threats both inside and out, when every decision carried the risk of triggering a collapse, Billy chose the most sensitive moment to strike in the cruelest way possible. He didn't charge into direct revenge because Billy knew Victoria would always be stronger in open confrontation. She had the instincts of a leader, the backing of a powerful system, and the ability to turn crisis into proof of dominance. So Billy refused the straight road. He chose the long way around. He chose to pull a predator into the game zone dangerous enough that Victoria would be forced to face the darkness. Someone unpredictable enough that she couldn't manage it with logic and corporate structure alone. And in Billy's mind, the perfect name was Matt Clark, a figure from the past whose feud with the Newman family had never truly died. A threat so lethal it didn't need embellishment. Billy sought out Matt in secret, not like a man begging for help, but like someone offering a deal dipped in poison. He didn't approach with naive trust. He approached with the posture of a man who understood he was handing his enemy a weapon yet still convinced himself he could keep the handle in his own grip. Billy never believed Matt would become a loyal ally. He only needed Matt to become the storm that hit Victoria where it mattered, the force that made her sway. His motivation carried a special kind of cruelty. He was willing to unleash another monster into the arena as long as that monster sank its teeth into the exact place he wanted to destroy. Deep down, Billy justified it with cold logic. If the Newman Empire had used men like him as tools, then he had the right to use someone else as his tool now. The difference was the cost would be far higher, and Billy knew it. He just chose to pretend he didn't care. To persuade Matt, Billy didn't need grand speeches. Matt already had too many reasons to hate the Newmans, too many grudges that had never been buried, too many scars that still burned. Billy only needed to place the right target on the table, to point directly at the weakness Victoria tried to hide behind her calm strength. He convinced Matt that attacking Victoria wasn't just a strike against one persona, it was a punch to the heart of Newman Enterprises, a blow that could ripple into financial damage, shattered credibility, and the most brutal consequence of all, destabilizing the legacy Victor treated as untouchable. Billy spoke with the authority of someone who knew the company from the inside, its habits, its blind spots. The ways Victoria's confidence could become a crack if you struck hard enough in the right place. Matt didn't need to believe Billy was good. He only needed to believe Billy was useful. And in the world of old enemies, usefulness is the only requirement for partnership. From that moment, the alliance between Billy and Matt grew like a hidden tumor inside Newman Enterprises. It didn't announce itself. It didn't roar. It didn't need to. It operated in the most dangerous way possible, quietly bleeding the system from within, leaving everyone exhausted and uneasy without immediately understanding why. Billy supplied internal fragments enough for Matt to identify which projects Victoria was protecting, where she was placing her baits, where she was pouring her resources. And Matt, with the instincts of a professional saboteur, began targeting the exact pressure points Victoria couldn't afford to ignore. Financial trouble appeared as if it had grown naturally out of the market itself. Investments stalled. Timelines slipped. Projects that once looked solid suddenly showed fractures that didn't belong. In only a few days, stability became an illusion. Victoria sensed the abnormality almost immediately. Not because she was paranoid, but because she lived in a world where numbers always had explanations and volatility always had origins. When her projects began to stagger in a way that didn't match internal reporting, she understood at once that an outside force was pushing into spaces that should have been locked down and protected. She refused to panic. She refused to let anyone around her see doubt in her eyes. But inside, a storm detonated. Victoria recognized the feeling. It was the same sensation that came when an enemy you thought you defeated returned, not with brute force, but with calculated patience, tearing down the foundation one layer at a time. And if this enemy had been invited in by someone on the inside, the danger multiplied into something far worse than she wanted to admit. Victoria began investigating with the cold discipline of survival. She didn't chase a culprit with emotion. She chased one with logic, with footprints, with data that had to confess the truth it was hiding. The deeper she dug, the clearer it became that the sabotage wasn't random. There was precision in the way her projects were being hit, as if the attacker understood exactly which moves would trigger the strongest domino effect. That precision obsessed her, because it sharpened one question until it felt like a blade against her ribs. Who could know this much without being part of Newman? The feeling of violation made her furious and humiliated. A leader can accept being attacked, but she couldn't accept being attacked in a way that proved her own house was no longer clean. Then, in what seemed like an accidental moment, Victoria touched a piece of evidence that turned her blood to ice. It wasn't a blatant confession. It wasn't a document stamped with a signature. It was a Tracian irregular access window, a strange timestamp, a small chain of actions that carried the scent of someone familiar. Victoria sat with it, forcing her mind to rebuild the puzzle from scattered fragments. And when Billy's name surfaced, she didn't want to believe it. Not because she still had hope, but because this level of betrayal was too vicious to accept. Billy wasn't just opposing her. He was opening the door for an old enemy to walk back in and trample everything she was trying to hold together. The realization stole the air from her lungs. If Billy's actions had stopped at simple obstruction or petty revenge, it might have remained within the bounds of internal warfare. But aligning with Matt pushed the conflict into a deeper circle of hell, where the consequences weren't limited to lost profits or damaged projections. This threatened to collapse trust and security across the entire Newman empire. Victoria felt as if she'd been stabbed in the most vulnerable place. Her belief in the people who once stood close enough to enter the most protected rooms of her life. That's why her fury wasn't just the rage of ACO being undermined. It was the rage of a woman being betrayed at the deepest level by a man who did it deliberately, as if proving that every boundary could be shattered. Victoria didn't hesitate for long. She confronted Billy with a pressure that made the air itself feel heavier, like the room was shrinking around them. No shouting was required. No explosive theatrics were necessary. The tension alone was enough to suffocate. Victoria looked at Billy the way someone looks at a stranger wearing a familiar face, and the sight sent a chill down his spine. Because Billy had wanted a reaction. He wanted her shaken. He wanted her hurt. But the moment he watched that hurt harden into ice inside her eyes, he realized he had awakened something far more dangerous, complete and irreversible severance. Victoria accused Billy of betrayal and sabotage, and in her mind it was no longer an emotional charge. It was fact, proven through consequences, through the damage Matt was carving into her world. Billy stood cornered between two humiliating choices: confess and become the traitor she believed him to be, or attempt justification and look even more pathetic in her eyes. Either way, Victoria wasn't listening through compassion anymore. She was listening through the ruthless survival instinct of a woman protecting a legacy. And that instinct turned the confrontation into something that escalated fast and open, or not because they wanted spectacle, but because the truth had grown too large to hide. The shock spread like a crack through glass, widening with every second. Relationships inside Newman Enterprises suddenly felt fragile. The ground beneath every alliance began to shift. Victoria realized she wasn't only being attacked from the outside by Matt, she was being struck from within by Billy. The two-sided threat forced her into the one thing she hated most, doubting everyone, even those she once trusted. And that, in its own twisted way, was Billy's real victory, not the damage to one project, but the damage to Victoria's sense of safety inside the empire she commanded. Meanwhile, Billy began to feel the price of the game he had unleashed. He had believed Matt was a blade he could aim at Victoria's confidence, a weapon he could control. But he quickly understood Matt wasn't a blade that stayed in your hand. Matt was a predator, and once freed inside Newman territory, he wouldn't only bite where Billy pointed. He would bite wherever it benefited him, wherever it kept him alive, wherever it made him stronger. Billy realized that if this war continued, he could become the first sacrifice. But by then, retreat had lost its meaning. He had gone too far from shore. And the most frightening part was that he wasn't even sure he wanted to return back, as returning meant facing the truth that he had turned himself into the enemy of the one person who had once mattered most. Victoria stood at the center of the storm with a loneliness that felt almost supernatural. She understood the Newman Empire had survived countless battles, but this one carried a different poison. It was wrought from the inside. It didn't just want money, power, or market share. It wanted trust. And once trust was stolen, everything left behind was nothing but a hollow skeleton. Victoria knew she had to strike back. She knew she had to prove Newman Enterprises couldn't be broken by an old enemy and a familiar-faced traitor. But she also knew that to win, she would have to become colder, sharper, more ruthless than ever before, and the cost of that ruthlessness would be a piece of her humanity. The open war between Victoria and Billy began like an earthquake, and every eye turned toward them as if the entire empire was watching itself fracture from the inside. Every move from here forward wouldn't just decide who was right or wrong, it would decide whether Newman stood firm or shattered into pieces. Billy had no honorable retreat left. Victoria had no room for mercy. And Matt waited in the shadows, patient, watching them grind each other down, ready to step out and claim the remains like the only true victor. And just when Victoria thought she'd finally seen the full map of Billy's betrayal, one small detail froze her blood again. The way Matt was sabotaging her didn't feel like a man acting blindly after a long absence. It felt calculated, informed, almost too perfect, like he had been given more than Billy was admitting, or worse, like Billy wasn't the only one opening doors from the inside. And this war was only the opening act of a far greater strike waiting to bring Newman Enterprises down a second time. On our TV Spoilers channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.